This is the Olympic Files, and I'm Al.
And I'm Theo, and this is Once Upon a Time Part 5.
Yeah, you're gonna have to start counting on your other hand now. It's a joke.
Yeah.
Forget it. Never mind. A little icebreaker humor didn't work right there.
That's what got it. Well, this is Al. You and I are corporations because the United States is a corporation, and the state we live in, our respective states, those are sub-corporations, and the counties within those respective states are sub-corporations, and our cities are sub-corporations. So what does that make us? Sub-corporations? You and I with our capitalized letters on our driver's licenses and whatnot. The
mortgage,
fictitious you and I.
Well, people are. I don't really think you have a problem. They seem to have a problem with the United States being incorporated. Like well, we went through that with the two idiot brothers, if you remember.
Yeah, the Eschaton brothers.
Yeah. And it's like, well, what's the problem? I mean, one of the definitions of the United States is a corporation, and it's right out there on Manta and Veromi. But besides that...
Well, no. See, you see, they had a college professor that told them that wasn't true.
And we know they never lie.
Yeah.
All right, but so people do have a problem with the United States being a corporation, and they do have a problem with themselves being a corporation. And the criticisms that were flimsy, that were leveled against us and Randy at that time, were really, they came back with the one email saying, well, try to take your labor to the stock market. And it's like, what are you talking about? That's something you said. You create the statements you want to debunk yourself. Don't bring that thing in here. We never said anything like that whatsoever. But we are, and I guess, and again, I don't get deep into this legal stuff, but as corporations, we're also, persons as well, and that comes from, and that's the other thing. They said, well, what do you think it is, Roman law? It's like, yeah, jerk, it is Roman law. So.
Yeah, we were created men and women, not persons, and not residents. Those are legal fictions.
So we're thrown right in there with corporations, really.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, again, I don't think anybody has a problem with cities and towns. Heck, I live outside the incorporated limits of a certain city. I see the sign every day. People do, they may not think about it that much, but you're a business, so you should. And that's why, if Walter Burien is still out there doing whatever he's doing, that's why it makes sense that every city or town or county should have an annual financial report. And I'm not
a comprehensive annual financial report.
A CAFR, right, exactly, CAFR. Now, the thing is, and I'll make this real quick and get it back to you, just to give you an example. In my employ as a sports writer, after a number of weeks, I got friendly with another guy in the booth who was a lawyer from another town. No, not that, a lawyer. Yes, a lawyer. And I asked him, and he was a good guy. His son played, that's why he was there. And I asked him, I said, shouldn't every town have a CAFR, a comprehensive annual financial report? And he stood there for about 20 seconds, and he could see, he processed, he was running it through his mind, and he goes, yeah, like he never thought of it before. He said, yeah, they should.
Wow.
And I said, but here's what's so great. So before I could even say it, he turns to me and goes, but good luck trying to get it.
Yep.
And he goes, well, you're in the press, maybe you could. I said, but, it's funny. I said, I've just broached this with you. You never really thought about it. You have to say there is. They show everybody budgets, but they never show them the annual financial reports. And I said, but then what was the first thing? You knew how they would behave. They would go into a bunker mentality. Good luck trying to get it, sucker. I thought that tale was worth just kind of moving off the main storyline. So thank you for letting me do that. I hope you were so edified by it, Theo. And please, by all means, continue.
Yeah, well, it's not just our city and county. Here's a quote from the first page of the chapter, the aptly named chapter, Bend Over America. And this from the book, The United States is Still a British Colony, by James Montgomery. Here's a quote from Montgomery. The United States is a corporation, which is a continuation of the corporate charters created by the King of England. The states, upon ratifying their individual state constitutions, became sub-corporations under and subordinate to the United States. The counties and municipalities became sub-corporations under the state charters. The United States is still a British colony. We are still subject to the King. The King declares our taxation will be forever. And, okay, you want further proof? Montgomery went to his particular state constitution, and for him that being North Carolina. And he writes of that, he says, you have to continue to go back in historical documents and see if what you have been taught is correct. The following quote is from Section 25 of the 1776 North Carolina Constitution Declaration of Rights. So this is from North Carolina again. And it says, and provided further, that nothing herein contained shall affect the titles or possessions of individuals holding or claiming under the laws heretofore in force, or grants heretofore made by the late King George II or his predecessors, or the late Lords Proprietors, or any of them, and that being in the Declaration of Rights, 1776, North Carolina Constitution. Montgomery writes, can it be any plainer? Nobody reads. They take what is told to them by their schools and government as gospel and never look any further. They are, of course, quick to attack anyone that does do so because it threatens their way of life. It rocks the boat. So it, of course, says that whatever they're signing in 1776, it's not going to nullify the laws and the titles that have already been signed. That is, signed over to the King of Britain.
Are you referring to the Declaration of Independence? Is that correct?
Yes, this 1776. This would have been the same time.
But the thing is, that was a nice little essay, but there was nothing binding to it.
Oh, you mean the Declaration
of Independence?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you're referring to 76, my point is that it's a nice document, but there's nothing binding in it. It's kind of like a pledge, if you will. So, in fact, it would have been better if that were the law of the land besides, rather to supplant the Constitution. But, again, that was something that was put out there for declaration, hence the Declaration of Independence, but it had nothing binding. So, I mean, the Brits looked at it like, that's cute. Okay, great. You know, they rubbed our heads and said, go on. So.
Yeah. And there's, well, as far as actually owning the land, Montgomery goes on. This is a couple of pages later. He says, there was no way we could have had a perfected title to this land. Once we had won the Revolutionary War, we would have had an unconditional surrender by the king, and this did not take place. It's not what took place at Yorktown when we let the king off the hook. Barring this, the king would have had sold us this land for us to have a perfected title, just as the Indians sold their land to the king, or the 8 Carolina proprietors sold Carolina back to the king. And this is the key here. The Treaty of 1783, the one that King George wrote, dictated, the Treaty of 1783 did not remove his claim and original title because he kept the minerals. Oh, okay. Let me, a couple more sentences here. This is key. Let's see. The king could not just give up America to the colonialist, nor would he. He would, in fact, violate his own law of mortmain to put these laws in dead hands, no longer to be able to be used by himself or his heirs and successors. He would also be guilty of harming his heirs and successors. I refer to this couple of shows back that, the royalty in Britain, they weren't stupid. Long ago, they wrote a law that prevented any weak or under duress king or queen from giving away the keys to the storehouse, which everything in that storehouse was, of course, it's due to be inherited by his posterity. And so they passed a law long ago to where no king and queen could do that.
Well, it goes back to what we said earlier, that the law of the world is business. It's mercantilism.
Yeah.
It's not any of this stuff about, like we said, giving huddled masses yearning to be free a place to hang out. It wasn't like that at all. It was about new markets and it's about business. And I wouldn't even argue whether that should be the case or not, because it's been the case. I won't get into what should have, could have been, but that's the way it is. And it's still to this day. It's all about the money. It's not about freedom. The degree of liberty and freedom that we have here is based on how much money you have. The more money you have, the freer you are. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Well, in practical everyday matters, that's usually so.
Yeah, I don't think people with a lot of money have I don't hear them yelling about freedom and liberty and all this other stuff.
They're, John the Baptist or Gandhi or something, and they're really okay with monastic poverty.
Well, in essence, we still can be that way to a certain point. We have no way of getting out of the system per se, unless you're rich enough to do that. So as long as you labor and you get paid slave wages, it's a question of how free are you in your mind. And I know that sounds awful, psychobabble, but it is true. Don't get hung up on it because you can't take it with you, and you're not going to be here all that long. So, But it's all about business. There's no two ways about it, and that's what happened here as well. And if you think about it, what was Britain's greatest colonial tool? It wasn't guns at the time. It was opening up countries to the markets, the British East India Company, right? And also what happened here, which was mostly, I think, the work of the Virginia Company. So there you have it. I mean, that was the way they spread their reach. Then afterwards, they sent in the military to keep things the way they were. I don't know. Did you ever think about that?
Yeah, and I would even wonder if you want to talk about a specific key that opened those things up, I wonder if you would point to the barristers of England as being that tool.
Well, there's a progression here. You're right. And I forget, I had an interview with someone, we went back and forth about it, kind of kiddingly or tongue-in-cheek. But what is the progression? It's like open markets. What would come next? Open markets. Send in the bankers. Send in the lawyers, and then create a government and an army. That's it.
Yeah.
So you're right. That's a necessary step. Once you get the power, you have to find a way of keeping it and making it as difficult as possible for peasants like ourselves to understand the damn stuff that they write because it's impenetrable.
Yeah, the lawyers, they have to legally justify it, and then they have to hide the keys of knowledge, begin writing contracts in the Byzantine language that the average person can't understand.
Right. They produce nothing. They don't have any job unless somebody's doing something. And I mean, I'm not against, lawyer's a lawyer, that's fine. You know what I mean? But the thing is, everyone will agree, they've got themselves into a situation where you have to come to them to do certain things. And they wouldn't have any work unless there were people like ourselves. And so they write this somewhat arcane language. As you said, they set themselves up as a somewhat secret society, one that's more out in the sunshine than others. And they're just, they're parasites on your rear end.
And some of their language games that they play, they set themselves up as a priesthood, really,
right.
with their language. But some of it is so puerile, so childish. It's like a game that a little child would play in the sandbox to keep others from playing with his toys. What I mean by that is they'll play these little linguistic word games or punctuation word games that are so childish, and yet it works. Like, for example, here's a quote from the same chapter by Montgomery. After he writes, the U.S. Constitution is a treaty between the states, the geographic states, creating a corporation for the king. And then he writes, he offers a quote later on. He says, in the below quote, pay attention to the large, or capital S, state and the small, lowercase s, state. The large, capital S, state is referring to the corporate state and its sovereignty over the small, lowercase state because of the treaty. And then there's this paragraph from a court case where obviously this judge was hip to the whole deal, where he alternates. One moment he'll be talking about the lowercase s geographic state. The next moment he'll be talking about the uppercase legal fiction district state. And this is from the court case is from, it's Hamilton versus Eaton from 1796. So you see the little punctuation games even they play. It's just childish, but it works.
Before you move away from this, I want to go back to what you said about it's almost lawyers, right? Or almost like a priesthood.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, tell me something. How did this happen? All right, think about a courtroom. Think about a church. All right?
Yep.
Who comes in their black robes and everybody stands up? The judge? And
that's right.
And the preacher, pastor, priest. I mean, whether they have something on over that vestment. But in black, comes in, everybody stands up. Then you've got the certain levels. You have, what would you call, is it the narthex? Is that what they call it? I don't know. No, the sanctuary, I guess.
Yeah,
The narthex is on the other end. Okay. They have the sanctuary, where again, the pastor, preacher, whatever, priest, sits on top, above everyone, just like the judge.
Yep.
Then a couple levels down, which I think is kind of funny, off to the right, you either have the choir box or you have the jury.
Yep.
And and you got all these levels, and of course there's the pews with the chairs for everyone to sit in and watch the proceedings. What in the world happened there that those two scenarios are so alike?
On the website GeorgeGordon.com, that guy goes into great detail in a short little essay, and he specifically was in a contentious talk with a corporate pastor where he was telling the corporate pastor, who was from Tennessee, he chided him because the pastor was trying to chide him, Gordon first, and Gordon pointed out to him that if you are in the legal system of Tennessee, and he outlined what you just went through only in more detail, he said, you are obeying that religious system, and yes, everything to a T. Even the bailiff is like, I don't know, the usher or something.
Yeah, there you go. There's even further. That's right. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you got to wonder why that is, but nevertheless, it is. And what you had said, whether you knew what you said at the time about it almost being like a priesthood, I guess you could say it was a priesthood,
Yeah, and it continues to be.
All right.
There are two things that Montgomery writes about in I guess it's mainly in this work of the two. The United States is still a British colony. Two things I wish he had gone into greater detail. He goes into some. I just wish, at least for me, it's not clear enough. One of them is he states that in the 1840s is when the law of the sea, admiralty, came onto land through a series of court decisions in the 1840s that are now called the Insular cases. That's how admiralty creeped onto land, and he explains it, but not enough for this dolt. So I wish he had gone into greater detail. The other thing that I'm looking at right now that pertains more to what we're talking about today, I wish he had gone into greater detail about this for myself. There was something, maybe, Al, maybe you know about this. There was something that was set up, and I think it was set up even before. Yeah, it was set up even probably when the Pilgrims landed or shortly thereafter. So this is before the Revolutionary era. There was a small body of men called the Council of State that were set up to be advisors to the governors of the geographic states, kind of like, ancient Harry Hopkins types, or Henry Kissinger types. It's weird. And they could not be any form of elected official. They could not be in the military. They had to be this totally independent body, and yet they're not independent of Britain. And I think they were made up of lawyers. But he spends a couple of pages on this, but I'm still not sure. Let me just give you a few quotes on it. He said, "The job of the first Council of State was to make sure the governor followed the king's wishes, that the laws they passed had to conform to the king's law." Skipping down here, Montgomery says, "The Council of State still exists today, although it has been modified several times." And then he lists who could be in on this Council of State and who couldn't. No treasurer can have a seat. Nobody in the House of Commons, which would be the the House of Representatives. No officer or regular in the Army of Navy. No Secretary of State or Attorney General or clerk of any court record. In the next page, Montgomery writes, "The king continued to rule through this Council of State until several things were in place, namely his bank, his laws, and his tradition. The king succeeded by the acceptance of the American people that they were free, along with the whole of our history not being taught in our schools." Excuse me. "The next change to the Council of State came at the conquest of this country," which is referring to the Reconstruction in 1868, I guess. He gives a quote here that says, "Even up till 1868, in North Carolina, the Council of State shall advise the governor." But then he writes this, and this is the last paragraph on this. "After the Civil War, the conquest of America, you see those that were allowed to be in the Council of State were elected officials. Under the 1776 North Carolina Constitution, it was still unlawful for these elected officials to be councils of state. Why? Because the king could not trust the common man to obey him now that they thought they were free. After the Civil War, the Council of State was no longer needed to fulfill the public policy of the king, but the Council of State still exists today. It is just in a reduced capacity as far as the king goes. Now, the king had the 14th Amendment, his lawyers in the government, his bankers in control of the government's money, and above all, the greed that causes most in office to continue the status quo." So after the Reconstruction and the so-called passing of the 14th Amendment, the Council of State was no longer important. It apparently is still around in some capacity. But I wish he was more clear as to who these guys were. I think he tries to be. I needed more clarification. Clearly, this is an important little body of, I don't know, what do you want to call them, spies or what?
We might be able to get in touch and get some clarification on that.
Okay.
The thing is, we talk about the kings and such. Just to make one thing clear right now, if you think kings and queens or whoever are the crown heads of whatever countries in Europe are effete, think again. They're going to come roaring back big time after their little masquerade is over. They've sat back and allowed their countries to go through this experiment, most of which is called social democracy over in Europe. But they still run the show. We laugh at Queen Elizabeth, blah, blah, blah. But in essence, they are still on top of the pile. And those who sit in Parliament and in the Senate or wherever it is across the world, but especially as it is here and in Europe, they still hold the keys to the kingdom. And then they will come back out very obviously in a certain amount of time. And I'm going to just throw this out here now. It's not something that we can go into, but if you want to hit on it, by all means. I've been just thinking about this, and the one continuum of power, as far as you can trace back, seems to me to be the Roman Empire in one form or another. And I say that because if you look at Europe, to me, that pretty much is the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. And after Rome fell, I think it morphed into something else, which probably was the Romanist Church, and also with Great Britain. Then after that, who do you really have except a handoff to the United States? But it's not that, again, that we do our own thinking. We're still at the behest of not only Britain and the Vatican, but I would say the Roman Empire in general, which could be, you could call it the EU. So I know that's kind of out there, but seriously, if you think about the one power on this earth that lasted as long as it did, even though, like I said, it might have morphed into different shapes and is coming back one last time as the final Holy Roman Empire, I would say, it's Europe. You have any thoughts on that in particular?
It just brings to mind one of the more memorable images from that massive tome of Carroll Quigley. And no, I don't think that Quigley was telling the whole story or anything like that, but it was an impressive work, and he did, of course, reveal a lot of stuff. But he writes, it was really captivating writing, historical writing, as well as all of the things he documented. But he wrote how he was trying to envision what the German tribes must have felt like when they came upon Rome just as Rome was collapsing. And he notes how, and he talks about the next couple of centuries, where these Roman tribes, they were, even though they had come upon this crumbling empire of Rome.
You mean the German tribes?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I said Roman.
Yeah, you mean Germany, or when they came upon the crumbling Rome. Go ahead.
Yeah, the Visigoths, and the various other ones. They nevertheless were still so impressed with the Roman Empire, of what they did see of it, that they kept trying to recreate it within their own ranks for the next at least couple of centuries. And they couldn't quite get it down, but they kept trying to copy what they had seen, the vestiges of it. It was fascinating. Yeah, I had never thought of that until I read that by Quigley, but he's definitely right there. But you know what? Yeah, humankind has been trying to, at least in the West, has been trying to recreate the Roman Empire ever since then.
In the West? I'd say this, that we were, let's see, it sits with us, I think, but it really doesn't, and we've gone through that because of the relationship that we have with Britain. It makes it seem like we're all that, but we really aren't. Again, Britain's elite in the city of London have just kind of sat back. It does not matter to them that they aren't credited with this awesome power. And if you take a look at the families in the United States generationally who have run this place and certainly have grabbed it lock, stock, and barrel in the 20th century. I mean, look at Rockefeller, Carnegie, those families. It doesn't matter that nobody's paying attention to them. I mean, they're true professionals. They know they run the show. At least they take their orders on this side of the pond, and they get things done. And they don't mind that they're not out there in the limelight. That's really where it's at. So, like I said, they're consummate professionals, and they don't need to necessarily have their names in the paper and whatnot, but they certainly have the money, and they know exactly who runs it, and that's enough for them.
Yeah, this country is run by, like you said, on this side of the pond, by the dynastic clans, like the Rockefellers, Mellons, DuPonts, just a few others.
Yeah, Carnegie, Ford.
The Pews, and there's just a smattering of others, yeah.
Yeah, so that's where we're at. We're at the last, I guess, in the final throes of whatever this is around the world. It's going to eventually come back to the Roman Empire. If it's the EU, whatever you want to call it, they're not going to get a hair harmed on them. They're still running the show, and then they eventually will come back out when we get what was promised us, and that's this new serfdom. So our role in it has been to expedite that, and we've done that for a century. And by the way, what I said about the robber barons grabbing power, they had that going into the 20th century. They had already started on trying to make policy, if you will, in so many sectors of American life. And certainly, as you progress through the 20th century, you can see there's less and less congressmen and senators who haven't been bought. And to this day, you might get a rookie that comes in there, doesn't want to play ball, doesn't want to do what D.C. does. They won't stick around long. So we have no government per se. We just have a body that looks like it's a political process, but it is not. And but go ahead, you wanted to say something?
Oh, yeah, you jogged my memory about something that I was just reading about. And actually, this is in the other James Montgomery book, A Nation Defeated in Victory, where he provides, you mentioned fewer and fewer congressmen who were willing to stand up and try to stop the takeover of the robber barons. In the first half of in the early stages of the 20th century, when the robber barons were sealing the deal, passing their Federal Reserve Act and the Income Tax Act, if you can call that having been passed, there are quotes, really poignant quotes from congressmen like Lindbergh's father, of course.
Whose?
Charles Lindbergh Sr.
Right.
And there are also two others who, oh man, one of them was Congressman Louis McFadden.
McFadden, that's right. Mm-hmm.
And another one was Senator, whatever else you think about him, he was right about this, Senator Huey Long. Those guys were railing against what was going on. You know what it was? They really got up in arms over the 1933
Banking Act, yeah.
Banking Act by FDR. Long and McFadden did, and you know what? Guess what happened to both of those guys? They had some really mysterious deaths. Obviously, Long was obviously assassinated, and McFadden was probably poisoned. I know Eric Phelps thinks that. He probably was.
Right. Interesting, too, because Huey Long really liked Smedley Butler.
Mm.
That might have could have been a marriage made in hell to a certain extent.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Long respected Butler, and there may have been a thought in Long's mind to get him to become his running mate.
Long was a legitimate threat to FDR to take the presidency from him. And, even in that mainstream movie called Kingfish, where John Goodman played Huey Long, they even imply that. They actually imply that FDR had some kind of a hand in the assassination of Huey Long. You watch that movie, and that's what you come away with.
But, I mean, he wasn't a threat to FDR. He was a threat to the power block that supported FDR, which is Wall Street.
Exactly, yes.
And that's why that whole deal, I think we spoke to this before. If not, it's been a long time. You and I are both aware of it, so we kind of forget to whom we've not spoken this. But this whole thing about Wall Street supposedly throwing a coup, trying to raise an army, and then have Butler lead that army down on Washington to throw out FDR, to me is total bunk. I've gone through enough of it with other authors and Butler's own papers. To me, what this did was, it was a ruse that engendered a certain amount of sympathy for Roosevelt, because they knew what was going to happen. The power brokers knew what was going to happen with FDR in office. And they didn't want any threat to that. And at that time, let's say that they could not manipulate the elections as well as they can do today, or even 50 years ago. So they didn't want anybody to rock their plans. And the Kingfish might have seemed to have been a problem for them, and that was eliminated. But, I mean, I would just say that FDR obviously didn't do anything that he wasn't told to do. And he certainly was Wall Street in his early life. I mean, both the Roosevelts and the Delanos, both were Wall Street through and through. He, when he was a lawyer, had an office downtown in the Wall Street section. So
and as you yourself have even noted before, I think you came across a reference to this by Fletcher Prouty, that the British may have offed FDR himself.
Yeah, in fact, it's ironic. In the wee small hours of the morning, I couldn't sleep, and I just took a look at that. And I'm going to put a link up to that because that states the case clearly. But it's interesting, yes, that there's a thought that he was either assassinated, well, something he committed suicide. Let's just put he was offed. And there's enough reasons why he could have been. And this goes back to what we had said, that the record showed that Hoover was originally desired to break the Banking Act on the people in his lame duck period of presidency, because at that time, presidents didn't take over till March, not January. So Hoover had this lame duck 90-day period, and they wanted him to do it, and he was like, no way. And they really had less of a grasp on him because he was going out the exit door. So Roosevelt didn't want to do it. Hoover said, I'm not doing it. So FDR got the pleasure of breaking the Banking Act to the United States. Also, it could have been that he didn't have the stomach to okay the two atom bomb explosions in Japan, of course, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And if he didn't have the stomach for it, as we had said a couple of shows back, Harry didn't mind, and Harry went ahead and did it. So, yes, I mean, assassination is the game. And, of course, we don't have any in the United States because there are always lone gunmen running around. It's baloney. So, yes, there is some thought that Roosevelt did not die from organic reasons, a cerebral hemorrhage. And then that goes back to the story about Gromyko being sent by Stalin to take a look at his body in state, and we're like, no, don't. Because if you had a cerebral hemorrhage, you would show certain signs. Yes, that's it. Now, there's another thing, too, where I think you wanted to go, and your point's well taken about some of the senators, Congress people, even into the 50s. We talked about the Cox and the Reese commissions that were trying to find out what in the heck the tax-exempt foundations were doing, and they were thwarted at every turn. But going back to what we were talking about the United States in its final stage, we're being used, and we're going to be thrown away eventually, but not before our money, our lifeblood, is absolutely drained from us. Where do you think the jobs are? Where do you think the corporations went? And then eventually they're going to get us into another war, kill off as many people as possible, and then there'll be no more United States as we've known it. There'll be no 700-pound gorilla on this planet. It won't be China and it won't be Russia. At that time, everybody's going to play ball and be nice. But going back to this whole situation about draining out the lifeblood, we think about where our tax money goes, or some of it, and we understand that the Federal Reserve is a private bank. But the Tea Party, for instance, who finally, I guess along with Glenn Beck, that jerk, I guess they finally came upon the fact that is the case, that the Federal Reserve is not federal, no more than Federal Express is. And they think that they got the keys to the kingdom now because they're going to go ahead behind Ron Paul and they're going to throw out the Federal Reserve. And they don't understand that nobody messes with the Fed. We said that before. You mess with the Fed, you're dead. That's it. Ron Paul can make all the nice noises he wants to, and every 4 years he doesn't go anywhere with this. And in the time in between the presidential elections, he makes a lot of nice noise. Nothing ever gets done except he gets reelected in his district. They'll reelect that fart even when he's been dead 10 years down in Texas. Now, it does not end with the Fed. Isn't that where you were going with, Theo?
Yeah, it's really nice that the Patriot types have finally caught on and found out about the Fed, and they're right in as much as they go there. But, you know...
You don't mess with the money. You never mess with the money.
And okay, so congratulations, folks. You've scratched the tip of the iceberg. You found out about the Fed. Do you want to know about the rest of the iceberg? Do you want to know what's actually under the water? Because the Fed is connected to and subordinate to the British Exchequer, which is a part of the British Crown, and the Crown is not the king. The Crown is the corporation of bankers, I guess, would be how I would explain it. But here's a quote from James Montgomery about the Fed and the British Exchequer. He writes, "What I will show you next will shock you. I made brief mention of it in Part 1, that taxes paid in this country were under treaty to the King of England. How about if I told you that the law that created our taxes and this country's tax court goes back in history to William the Conqueror. And to further help you understand the below definitions, the Exchequer is the British branch of the Federal Reserve. Here's a definition from Ballantyne's Law Dictionary. Exchequer, the English Department of Revenue, a very ancient court of records set up by William the Conqueror and intended principally to order the revenues of the crown to recover the king's debts and duties. It was called Exchequer, scacarum from the checked cloth resembling a chessboard. Oh, a Masonic reference there, which covers the table. That's from Ballantyne's Law Dictionary. This is from Black's Law Dictionary, 4th edition. Exchequer, that department of the English government which has charge of the collection of the national revenue, i.e. the Treasury Department. This from Bouvier's Law Dictionary, 1914. Exchequer, in English law, a department of the government which has the management of the collection of the king's revenue. And we are under that. Let's see. Oh, how is the word exchequer is still used today? Here we go. In Britain, the exchequer is the Federal Reserve, the same as our Federal Reserve. They just changed the name here, as they have done many things, to cloud what is taking place, hoping no one would catch on. Who wrote the Federal Reserve Act and put it in place in this country? Why, bankers from the Bank of England with their counterparts in New York. And then there are some very telling quotes, one of them again from Congressman McFadden, warning about all of this. And McFadden, he was naming names. He is, in this quote, he's naming the specific names of the banksters contemporaneous to this and part of this swindle. And yeah, they like you just said, you don't mess with the money powers. They look what happened to even Jesus when he did that.
Yeah, 3 days after throwing the bankers out of the temple, they got him before Pilate.
Yeah.
Now, that is symbolic, and it had to be done. There was no way that should be avoided, understand. But, and you do, I know. But it just seems, it's symbolic. It is absolutely symbolic that would be the particular party, if you will, that would be used to expedite, well, actually, I guess it happened on time, but to facilitate, let's put it that way, his crucifixion.
Yeah, real quick, and McFadden in his quote here, after he names these banksters, he even says here, he says that these guys, he says they were recently in the pay of Great Britain as chief economic. He says in his quote that these banksters are in the pay of Great Britain. This was a quote decrying the 1933 Emergency Banking Act. Yeah, McFadden, man, he had guts. And discernment. How rare. You don't see that anymore in Congress at all.
Again, you might have that one particular person, maybe a few, but they get marginalized. If you do not play ball, you don't stick around. You'll be ostracized, you'll be rendered powerless, and then eventually your constituency won't reelect you.
Or you'll be killed like McFadden was.
Well, I think they got most of that nasty business out of the way, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah.
All right. But going back to the crown, we're not talking about the crown. I mean, the crown stands for something. What do they call that? A Schenectady or something like that?
Yeah.
What,
an acronym?
Well, no, it's an item that stands for something else.
Oh, yeah. What is that called? Metonymy?
There's metonymy, and then there's the one I really like. It looks like synecdoche, but it's...
I know what you mean.
Synecdoche.
It starts with an L.
No, it doesn't. It starts with an S.
Okay, never mind.
Synecdoche.
Like to tease. Never mind.
Oh, that's another one too. Yeah, please. How many times have you used that in conversation in your lifetime? But we use it as an item that stands for a much bigger entity. So the crown, as what we're speaking about, is a crown that is a corporation and takes care of financial matters and the like, and especially back then, and is housed in the city of London. So it isn't the crown like like James Bond would say, for country, crown, whatever it was, God and crown, I don't know, when he just had relations. But that's what we're talking about. And you can look that up and see that it stands for something other than the king and queen.
And Montgomery and the I-Man go into that. I don't have that particular page.
There's some people who really love to get into this kind of thing. I guess they're probably accountants and such. I don't know. Maybe, lawyers certainly don't want anybody to know about this. And, of course, they go back and forth. We talk about the informer and Montgomery as if they're dead. They're not. But they are the two individuals who we've come upon that have done the most amount of research most recently and are still accessible. And because of that, the story goes that they didn't look for me. I looked for them. When I came down to my final realization in my search to find out the way things really are on this planet, and that is this: could it be that the whole story about the United States is a myth? Not the whole story, but a good part of it, which has brought us to this very thing that we're doing once upon a time.
What I find interesting is that those two guys, at least for the most part, were researching independently of one another, as I understand it, and yet what does ancient custom call for? Specifically, scriptural ancient custom calls for if you're going to attest to something, you need two witnesses. Well, we have our two witnesses.
Yeah, and if people, this is met with a great deal of animus, I guess you could say. But if you have an open mind, if anybody out there has ever wondered why certain things don't seem, it's like going through public school. You have this thing called the Electoral College, and, as a kid, I raised my hand and said, teacher, does this mean that we really don't vote directly for the president?
Yeah, that's right.
And the teacher not being, not trying to be anything except available to answer your question was subject to the same brainwashing as like, let me see. Same thing with lobbyists. Teacher, why do they have lobbyists on the Hill? Wouldn't that be called bribery anywhere else?
Yep.
And it's like, let me see. Well, our history is full of it, but we just kind of dust it over and walk away. And after a certain amount of time, I got tired of doing it. I had the dubious blessing, if you will, to have been born early enough that I heard and I saw stuff right after World War II in Korea. It started then, and I couldn't figure it out. Who cares? So, some of that stuff was still around. But, you go around in your life, you're not going to find too many people that want to share that with you, so you just forget about it and go on. Till a point comes when either you just say, I don't care, or, you know what, let me take a look into this. And that's what we've both done. And like I said before, the problem with Americans is they've been propagandized into believing they can't be propagandized. Now, we were to tell the Tea Party that this Fed goes back to Europe, to the international bankers, and that we're still paying tribute to whatever crown you want to talk about, and they'd laugh themselves sick, the idiots. And that's a great example of having partial knowledge is worse than having no knowledge at all. They just think that Ron Paul's going to throw out the Fed and everything will be good again. Oh, man, never in your life will you ever see it. It is impossible for that to happen. So, could I just share two anecdotes real quick?
Oh, please, yeah.
All right. You'll appreciate them, and I think you know them both. But I think it should be brought back out, and we're not going to explain it right now, and people are going to laugh themselves silly, but I'll tell you what, it is the truth. Deal with it as you may. One of them comes from the informer himself when he wanted to expunge himself from the IRS. He had written, a lot of people do it, whatever a lot is, compared to the population. The total population is a small fraction of a percent. But it does get done. And God bless them. Good for them. But you got to watch when you mess with the feds. So the I-Man went ahead and got himself out, furnished the documentation, crossed the T's, dotted the I's. But he stated that he didn't like the response he got from the IRS. He thought it was a little ambiguous. So he was not going to bite it, thinking that it might have been a baited hook. Instead, he filed paperwork with the nation-state known as the Vatican. Yes, he did. And then the Vatican sent it to the Attorney General of the UK and said, get him out of the system. And they got him out of the system. Now, if you believe that to be true, and you should, what does that tell you about the power in this world, financially and otherwise? We're not talking about...
I'd love to know what he said in the letter.
I'm assuming he still has it, but when we spoke, and we did that on air years ago, the documentation. Again, it's like reading a phone book, but you got to do it if that's, if the goal is to get yourself out legally. Now, the other story comes from a missionary who has a sister that's an academic and was attending a conference in Austria and asked her sister, the missionary person, if she'd like to come over. And she said yes. And so she had to find things to do when the conference was in session. And I believe this was in Vienna. And she availed herself of what was there in a palace-like setting, but there was a library. And her statement to me was, after she got done looking through what was there, she said they had every U.S. tax code book in the world. And she said, all I can tell you is that from the time I was there, which wasn't much, and from what she looked through, she said it was very obvious that the United States taxpayers paid, they financed the Marshall Plan to reconstruct Europe after World War II deconstructed it. So that's what all we're talking about is the financial ties that this country has. We're still paying. We've never stopped paying taxes or tribute to the powers that be. That's all there is to it. So, to say that you're going to get rid of the Fed is crazy. And you remember, don't you, when I had that interview with Bill Still, who was talking about how powerful the Fed was. This is in back of his book, The Money Masters, right?
Yeah.
And you remember, you know where this is going. And he's talking about how the Fed is so powerful, blah, blah, blah. But here's Still, and this is back in what?
Oh, no. He did the Jackie Gleason thing out. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And he says to me, well, he goes, well, George Bush will take care of that. This is the son. And I said to him, but what you've said is true about the Fed. I don't think George is going to do a whole lot. He went, well, yeah, probably,
That's when he did the homina.
So, I mean, people think they got it down, but they can't get the whole thing through their head. They stop at some point because either they choose not to go any further or they just can't, it just doesn't process. But it's the truth. That's the way things are. And as you said before, I mean, the reason we have Admiralty is pretty much the way things started from the very beginning with the Phoenicians. You needed something to control commerce on the waters. We had the law of the sea. And then the law of the sea was brought in on land, called Admiralty. I mean, that's the history of world commerce in 15 seconds. Your thoughts on that, Theo?
Yeah, I think it needed to be a particularly stringent law because when you're on the sea, you're alone and far away from your government. So they made it peculiarly hard, I think. And then, of course, when you bring that back on to the homeland, then, hey, you get this what we have now. This onerous set of laws.
The problem is it is hard, and we're going to have to wrap it up. So I'm going to give you a last shot. You got about a couple of minutes.
Okay.
I would think you would agree that our struggles here, as those people who are born in the United States of America, you want to be the man and woman, the flesh person that you are. You'd like to be that alone, but you're born in this system, and as a result, you have to deal with that other persona that you do have. And this is what we spoke about at the beginning of the show. There's a reason why on certain documents your name appears in capital letters. It is not a style choice. It is legal. And that is the other part of you that belongs to the corporation, whether you want to call yourself an employee of, a slave of, whatever you want to say. But that's the way it is. And you try to live your life without being crushed by that other persona. And as I think we can see now, it's becoming tougher and tougher to come up for air, and it's going to be that way. And I would assume that the only way that this can lead, the only place it can lead to, with what's happening with us right now and will continue at an accelerated rate, is a financial collapse to make everybody sit up and pay attention to the new motherland. And that's I'll call it a day for myself there. I'm going to throw it to you, Theo. Close up if you would.
Yeah, well, the ugly reality is the constitutional republic that was this country ended in 1868. And we, the little people, you and me and Joe Blow and Sally Housewife, since 1933, we have had the legal status equivalent to the brickmakers, to the brick-making Hebrews in ancient Pharaohic Egypt. Unfortunately, I have all the facts in front of me proving this, unfortunately.
Why is it unfortunate?
Well, you know, like you say, sometimes the news just ain't good.
It's so good, I know.
And, you know, you cannot accept it doesn't make it untrue just because you can't accept it. I'm sorry to report that's the way to, you know, the only difference is, though, we have had more toys to play with, but legally we own nothing and our money is worthless.
Yeah, and this whole system eventually will be revealed for what it really is. It may be another 20 years. I mean, who knows? We're premature in trying to forecast when things will happen. But the bottom line is, and I think really this is where we stand, and that is, if you want to know the truth, this is it. You want to get caught in the legalities and all the obfuscation, fine. The point is, the way we have seen our land is not as it is. Not our fault, but it's not as it is. And people right now are thinking, gee, something's wrong, but I will blame it on the other party. And as long as they stay there, they'll never realize who is behind the curtain. And that, in fact, there is somebody behind the curtain. So we'll wrap it up there. We'll pick it up. This is almost going to be the next audio will be kind of like part B to this, as we conclude this part 5. And Theo, anything else, or can we get out of Dodge?
We'll get out of Dodge.